Now, it's fortunate and definitely not accidental that Beyond is being hosted in Belfast this year. Northern Ireland is turning into a trailblazer for the creative industries. It's the only place in the UK where winter is coming is a promise, not a threat. More of that later. And I'll say unapologetically that I have no slides, no videos or other pyrotechnics for you today. It's just me. One, I can't compete with the heroic haptics we're going to see all around us and the demonstrations and the other great things that are going on here. Two, I can give your eyes a rest for a quarter of an hour. So if you're sitting comfortably, as they used to say on steam radio in the last century, I'll begin. To start with, let me take you back to the year of 1997. That was the year we had the happy news of a brand new birth. Roughly, I think the announcement went like this. To Britain and Northern Ireland, a new sector is born. We welcome the creative industries to the world. And it was to the world because we were the first country ever to define such a sector. The promising infant thrived and was soon being measured by the ONS via 9 key subsectors. And remember, they're advertising and marketing, architecture, crafts, design and designer fashion, film, TV, video, radio, photography, IT, software and computer games, publishing, museums, galleries and libraries. And if you thought, well, what's the connection between all those? And some have questioned that. There was a useful, economically slanted definition added to it, which said they're industries which have an origin in individual creativity, skill and talent, and which have a potential for wealth and job creation through the generation and exploitation of intellectual property. Now, that definition and the statistics championed by DCMS started to indicate both the size and growth of a sector we could now say was entering its adolescence. As we know, the latest year we have figures for is that the last year before COVID, 2019, when the GVA of the creative industries was actually measured at £115 billion. This represented around 6% of the entire UK economy, and growth, as I think you know, at often 3 to 4 times more than the national figure. So despite this impressive record, the sector was still viewed with, I think we could say, a good deal of suspicion by its older siblings, some in manufacturing, more than 100 years old, and didn't take this young whippersnapper very seriously, even though it had now attracted a couple of godparents to advocate for it, the Creative Industries Federation and the Creative Industries Council. And so we get to today. I'm going to argue this morning that the creative industries has now come of age. We're dominant. We've got dominant positions in music and TV formats. Our video games are played on all continents. The UK's advertising and marketing power global brands. The whole sector, including software, drove 58 billion of exports, £58 billion of exports of goods and services in 2019. Our design graduates create vehicles for all the planet's major manufacturers. As we know in this place, inward investment is pouring into the UK's film studios from the international video streamers, capitalising on our ideas, our craft skills, and of course, our tax credits. Let's not forget those. And I'm particularly fond of this stat. 9 out of the last 10 special effects Oscars have been won by British designers. This included the following collaboration: Best Representation of a Black Hole in Space. I was rather wondering whether that couldn't be a category of its own every year from now on. Now, the point is, we're demonstrating that the creative industries is a genuinely R&D sector, as much as, say, life sciences, fintech, or green energy. I'll give you hard examples of this in a moment, but of course, in this room, there are multiple examples of it. So the creative industries needs to be taken more seriously than it is. Then it will realize its full potential as a catalyst for our fast-growing knowledge economy. This is not to mention the sector's role as a definer of our culture, values, and identity. The trusted news that informs our democracy, the fiction in all media that enriches our national conversation, the video games which entertain us, the theatres and museums which define both place, as you were mentioning, Susan, place and drive tourism, the cultural exports which drive our soft power, more broadly, the rock upon which our humane education is built, and the means by which we nurture empathetic citizens. That's an equally important perspective, but one for another time. So when I say not taken seriously enough, is that just a bit of special pleading, a piece of sectoral lobbying? Well, there's nothing wrong with those, but no, I'm making a much broader point. Our national mindset is still too rooted in old certainties. We have some way to go to wake up to new realities. I've just conducted a survey to show you what I mean. I looked at recent national media mentions of 5 very important sectors just over a month, a period of a month. Life sciences, automotive, aerospace, oil and gas, and the creative industries. They weren't picked at random, because in 2019 the creative industries were worth more annually than those 4 other sectors put together. And rather like the Eurovision Song Contest, the votes are in. So, life sciences was mentioned 278 times. Aerospace, 494 times. Automotive, 537 times. Oil and gas, 742 times. And the creative sector, just 55 times. Now, I grant you that the latest James Bond movie and the new Adele single were probably mentioned several thousand times during the period, and also, obviously, that the prevalence of oil and gas is to do with the current energy crisis. But what I was really getting at was that a media mention of a sector in general is indicative of the public consideration and perceived importance of that sector. And our sector, despite its value, despite its growth, is still a bit of a well-kept secret. And that's a criticism for all of us. We have work to do. Actually, I couldn't resist adding one more sector to my survey, mostly for reasons of devilry. I also asked about fishing. It came out, wait for it, top, with 934 mentions. Now look, I like line-caught sea bass as much as the next person. But really, have we got our focus right? Are we sufficiently future-facing as a nation? Not on this evidence, not at all. Now, to make good industrial policy, you need a good data set. Despite the good work done by DCMS to map our sector overall, Andy Pratt, Professor of Cultural Economy at City University, argues we don't have the data set we need. Partly because the creative industries are considered by some as too artful a construct. That's my point about not being taken seriously enough. And partly because the lens through which we analyse our endeavours relies on old, mid-20th century definitions and on out-of-date taxonomies. Taxonomies which have not caught up with the realities of the service industries. As a result, as a nation, we're over-informing ourselves about declining industrial sectors, and we're under-informing ourselves about a high-growth one, such as the creative industries. Further challenges, though they're ones we'd better get used to in the future of the knowledge economy, are firstly, getting to grips with a sector which contains everything from sustainable textiles to augmented reality apps, and both of those, by the way, are represented in this room. And secondly, the complexity of mapping a sector which has some very big companies, but also many, many SMEs. Now, this matters because the government's Build Back Better plan for growth, published in the summer by Baillie, identified the creative industries as a key sector for the future. It actually mentioned us 8 times. Am I counting? You'll have guessed by now I really am counting, yes. So our potential has, in principle, been identified by Baillie. But to develop the policies which we'll need to deliver on that, we're going to need to do much better with data and understanding of what we can achieve. Skills is one of the 3 engines of growth defined by Baillie, by the way, but again, our national industrial and employment classifications are still based on older, more traditional models that fail to capture an accurate picture of our now dominant service industries. The Sector's Policy and Evidence Centre, which as you know is based at Nesta, has recently produced a very revealing report on these challenges, and I recommend you read it if you haven't. Now, just to underline how agile we need to become with the typhoon that's the 4th industrial revolution sweeping through our working lives, Dell Technologies recently posited that 85% of the job concepts we'll be using in 2030, a decade hence, have not yet been invented. And we need to look at the sunrise sectors, of which the creative industries is one, to imagine and generate these roles. As I pointed out in my 2017 review of the creative industries, the 1 million jobs that the sector can deliver in the next decade will be durable and high value, in contrast to other sectors where AI and automation will be destroying whole occupations. You need people for creativity, which brings me to the great work going on here in Northern Ireland. Belfast, as is rightly celebrated in this very building, was a shipbuilding city. What will be the dynamic industries here in the 21st century? That's a question that your universities, your politicians, and your talented young people are now answering. As you know, part of the answers you've come up with are life sciences and cyber technology. But you're demonstrating that the creative industries also have the potential to be a large-scale employer and an engine of growth. And almost by definition, they're for everyone to participate in, rather than rooted in one community. I like the way, by the way, you're calling them the new heavy industries, which I think is the title of the next section. I imagine that's heavy, as we used to say in the 1970s, as in heavy man, meaning cool. Anyway, I think it's pretty cool. That's a sort of old person's joke, but forgive me for it. My 2017 review recommended investment in creative clusters around the UK, as you said, Susan. More about these in a minute. But thanks to the imagination of AHRC and Innovate UK, both part of UKRI, this investment is happening. Belfast's bid was one of the successful ones, judged strictly on merit. Ulster University and Queen's have partnered with the likes of Northern Ireland Screen to start to realise what virtual production in the screen industries will look like within a decade. You already had a leading position in modern production, famously filming 8 seasons of Game of Thrones right here at the Titanic Studios, and several of you involved in that project are here in the room today. And this is not to mention, by the way, Line of Duty, close to my heart since it's made by an ITV company for the BBC, also shot in this locality. But you asked yourselves the question, in an age of 5G, robotics and real-time game engines, how will movies be shot in the future? With funding from both your city deal and your cluster, you're now setting about answering that question. There's the Smill Virtual Production Unit at Harbour Studios, with Ulster University as a partner. There's the training facility set up with Epic. This enables a crucible in which new companies can prosper as well. You have Humane and Retinize also pursuing new kinds of virtual production, and Yellow Design, who are demonstrating how AR is going to be a titanic consumer entertainment tool, and that's demonstrated here in this quarter. Not to mention how they've morphed also into the Rover app that I heard all about at lunch yesterday over salad. You have young, ambitious companies like Aura, working on its immersive animation platform, and Big Telly Theatre with their rather wonderful Zoom Macbeth. Now, just to channel my inner Ken Branagh, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition. Vaulting ambition indeed, and driven by defining fruitful R&D investments. And Big Telly Theatre, I think, themselves are now moving on to immersive online shopping apps. Success in these important projects will not only bring benefits to Northern Ireland, from inward investment to jobs to tourism, it'll also help drive Britain's creative industries forward as a world force and demonstrate that our sector is future-facing and will be fueled by the R&D it needs and merits going forward. By the way, there's another thing that's woefully out of date. Much of the research and development we invest in our sector, and I know this from the rapid modernization of ITV, the company I chair, much of this does not qualify technically as R&D in the current definitions because they once again belong to the last century. It's interesting that France, Germany, Italy and South Korea have got ahead of us by modernizing their R&D definitions. What about the other creative clusters and the allied audience of the future investment? Well, just to give you a flavor, and I think several of you are either involved or familiar with it, the Future Fashion Factory in Leeds is pursuing new materials, sustainable design and supply chain innovation. Creative Informatics in Edinburgh is exploring what data-driven AI should look like for creative businesses. In York, they're inventing new ways of delivering screen narratives via 5G. In Glasgow, they're showing how to exploit VR for industrial training. And in Bristol, they have an AR robot which is eating parts of the city. A colleague of mine at ITV saw that line in my speech and said, "Really? Should we know about this?" I said, "Relax, it's AR, it's in the clues in the name, it's augmented reality." Yes, well, there you go. That's just one of my colleagues. We're trying to bring him up to date. Now, I mentioned earlier the UKRI investment in the clusters. Over 5 years, this is going to be £56 million. Initially, and Andrew Chitty, my colleague, is sitting down there, he thought we'd attract a 28 million match from the sector. But that co-investment now looks like £150 million. That's astonishing, and it shows us several things. A small but shrewd public catalyst can trigger a much greater industry R&D investment, and one which would not have happened otherwise. And let me remind you of the context of this. Britain's target is to increase R&D as a percentage of GDP from its current 1.7% to 2.4% by 2027. It won't happen unless industry steps up in partnership with the government. The creative clusters, actually in the shape of things a small investment compared to other R&D heavy sectors, could now be scaled up in other parts of the country, delivering on the government's twin objectives of innovation and levelling up. These are admirable objectives, but they're sort of slogans at the moment, and they need to become policies. We can't solve Britain's productivity puzzle without investing in new ideas. And a point of reference for you, as we struggle from 1.7% to 2.4%, South Korea is already approaching 5%. So what else have we learned from the clusters? Well, that with locally led cluster initiatives like this, we can achieve greater regional penetration and greater connectivity with SMEs than we ever believed possible before. And that it's not only through profound and sustained collaboration, not just between creative design and technology, but also between the STEM disciplines and the humanities, that we'll imagine how our future is going to go. And that latter collaboration, by the way, between the STEM disciplines and the humanities is precisely how, as a nation, we've been fighting COVID. DCMS, to its credit, has also been running a similar creative scale-up investment for SMEs too. In the next phase of our internet age, must Silicon Valley take all the value, or can our sector pursue some unicorns of its own? The clusters have linked university research excellence to more than 575 SMEs so far in novel partnerships. This is how we're going to harness the best IP from our next generation of creators and properly exploit what we've always been good at, world-beating ideas. That looks and sounds to me like a plan for growth. As I've said, we have work to do to get our message over. Nowhere is this more valid than in the investment community. I sit on a couple of boards for Edge Investments, which unusually specialises in the creative sector. Their investment director, David Fisher, who's here today, by the way, and he can make himself known to you at the coffee break. Their investment director, David, points out that the financing gap for the creative economy across Europe is estimated to exceed 8 billion. That financing gap is evidence of the fact that the sector is not properly understood and the opportunities are not yet properly understood. David also reminds us of the Creative Industry Council's 2018 survey, which found that just that, lack of understanding by financiers and a distrust of our intangible assets. But Edge is showing that when you take the trouble to get to grips with creative businesses, there are good returns. Edge sits in the top decile of venture capitalists. So when they add the term createch to the existing fintech and edutech, we should take notice. Given we've still much work to do, much of the work I've mentioned on data and classifications to make that term createch really meaningful. Another truth David highlights is how the creative industries are increasingly important to other sectors in the UK economy. And I think that's an incredibly important point we shouldn't forget. Beyond the obvious point about the power of advertising and marketing expertise, which supports all sectors, increasingly, creative sector products and services contribute to supply chains elsewhere. It's calculated for every GVA pound earned in our sector in 2019, we also generated a further 50p elsewhere in the economy. As a nation, our global competitiveness will increasingly depend on the fusion of creative and technological innovation. Product design, service design, human-centered design, design engineering, these are all critical for sectors of the economy going forward. When I was asked a few months ago, would I put my name forward to be the next chair of the Royal College of Art in London, I thought about it very carefully, for about 2 seconds. And then I said, yes, of course, because its alumni include Johnny Ive, James Dyson, Thomas Heatherwick, because its graduates study robotics, mobility, inclusive design. They're imagining the devices we'll drive in the future through what sort of cities. And like other of our rainmaking colleges, of which there are some here, they already have a record of funded spin-outs in these fields. It's at this nexus of technology and design that much public and private value can be created in the next decade. Look out, by the way, for the announcement of the 10 commission projects of Festival 22 to be announced tomorrow. I've had a sneak preview of them, and they exemplify this sort of STEAM confusion. In fact, they were told to win, they had to combine at least 3 letters from STEAM together in their bid, which was a really good challenge, and it looks to me that the bids have really succeeded in that. Now, finally, as we were dozing gently this August, enjoying our first legitimate holidays for some time, a statement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer rather woke us up. Well, it woke me up anyway, and that's pretty difficult to do at the best of times. So the statement said, for any country, there are only a few things you're world class at. This is what Rishi said. For us, he said, in the UK, the creative industries, arts, culture is something we're genuinely world class at. I do think it's important. Rishi, we agree with you. We agree. I think the creative industries are like a coiled spring waiting to release their energy into the economy. We have the talent, we have the ideas. Now we need a much more ambitious strategy fed by 21st century data and insights. And from that will flow the investment opportunity. Yes, there's an important role for government and public funders, but most of all, this is down to us. Shall we get started? To be fair, I think you already have got started here in Belfast. Thank you, and I wish you all a very fruitful conference. Thanks very much.